Here we are at night, doing a late night, after dark edition of Sabrock's Opinions. Because I kind of forgot, until just now, to do a video. Also, you gotta wait till dark for it to be cool enough to record in the car these days. My studio gets quite warm during the day. But that's enough of an intro. Today we're talking about languages. Languages in a fantasy setting are kind of a funny thing. We tend to think of them as a sort of integral part of world building. Mainly, I think, because that's how Tolkien did it. Tolkien was very much big on having different languages for the different cultures. He had multiple Elvish languages, a Dwarven language, etc. The Dark speech. You know, there's lots of different languages. Him being a linguist, that makes sense. Most people are not linguists. So, you know, I think most people are not going to go and develop actual languages for their fantasy settings. And certainly, as far as I am aware, standard D&D settings do not have developed languages. They just sort of have, like, a list of languages by name. And maybe, like, a word or two established for them. So what does it mean in terms of gameplay? Well, languages tend to be just obstacles. You know, you encounter a piece of writing. It's very old. Maybe it's not in common. The common language, I'll get to that in just a moment. Maybe the thing they discover is not in common, so everyone checks their languages. Oh, I have Elvish, Dwarvish, and Goblin. Oh, I have Sylvan and Giant. Oh, I have you know, Aquan and Terran. You know, maybe, you know, everyone has a different sort of logic for how they pick their languages. A lot of people, because I've done this myself, a lot of people are going to just pick languages based on what enemies they intend to encounter, you know. So I think if it's going to be an Underdark, oh, maybe I know Undercommon or, you know, Deep Speech or whatever it is for your particular setting. You know, things that you think are going to be relevant. That's not usually how people learn languages. Usually you learn languages that are similar to or related to the culture that you are living in. Particularly in a fantasy type setting where you don't usually have the option of like, oh, I think Latin is an interesting language, so I'm going to go learn Latin for no reason, you know, or whatever the Latin equivalent is for your setting. The thing is, the frustrating thing really is that it's really, really hard to use languages in an interesting way in an RPG. Because either you know the language, in which case it might as well be in common, or you don't know the language, which is a complete block for whatever information was hidden in that language. It becomes a kind of code, like a compatibility of communication, which I guess fundamentally is what language is. But that's not what it feels like languages should be. Languages should reflect a character's culture, and language should have sort of symbolic meaning. You know, different languages are better at expressing different things. I've done some limited development on a couple of languages for my setting. In particular, I developed the Harukek language, which is the language of the Haruk, which are the orc equivalent creatures of my world. And, you know, I came up with a few, like, specific things about this language before I ever started working on vocabulary. One, you can't ask a question. There's no interrogative form of their sentences. So you can request information by saying, like, tell me this. But you can't ask a question, like, how are you? That's not a thing. Also, all words are single syllable. They can be combined as, like, compound words, but it's still very much like a staccato kind of language. And I did this specifically to, because it feels correct for an orky type of language, but also because then it means that native speakers of Harukek are going to sort of carry those habits forward. You know, they're going to prefer single syllable words, even if they're not necessarily like the most appropriate word. And they're going to avoid asking questions. You know, they're going to be more demanding. They're going to make statements. You know, these are the kinds of things that are important to the culture that speaks Harukek. And so the people who natively speak Harukic tend towards that. There's not really, I think, a great way to represent this in an RPG. I can write about it as far as world building, but it's kind of up to the players. Like, mechanically speaking, how do you represent that kind of cultural outlook? And I don't think there's a really good way, because it's kind of a minor thing, so it doesn't really feel like there should be anything really momentous about it. But at the same time, like, completely ignoring it feels like a loss of flavor. And the very existence of common, circling back to that, the very existence of common says that most of the time, you don't need to deal with languages, except a couple of times, like, they're keys for accessing information. And it doesn't feel great to say, like, oh, my elf is going to also speak Orcish, and is going to speak Goblin, and it's going to speak Giant, because those are bad guy languages, and so I want to know what the bad guys are saying. Like, that's a very metagamey kind of way to choose languages, but it really is, like, the only, like, optimal way to do it. You know, who cares about speaking Dwarvish or Elvish? You know, if they want to talk to you, they're good guys. They'll translate for you. They'll just speak common because everyone speaks common. You know, you got to speak the code of the enemy. And that's what languages really are in D&D. For my setting, not for my setting, for my game, Legends and Lore, I kind of have ignored languages entirely. I think it's sort of a non-issue. I think it's a lot better just to have it, like, make it DM fiat. Like, this is the perfect thing to be, you know, at the beck and call of the story, whatever the plot needs. Like, you don't know this language, go find a translation, go find a key. Or, you know, if you do know the language, then who cares what language it is, really? So I tend to think that a better way of handling languages, rather than just having a list of languages and then everyone, you know, picks a certain number of them, and then you have common for everyone to actually communicate in. I think a better use is simply to have, like, some scripts are unintelligible, either because they're too ancient or they're too obscure or what have you. And then it can be a plot point to go get that translated, or to use magic to translate it, or, you know, whatever it is. You know, if you're going to make it an obstacle, make it an obstacle. Don't make it an obstacle sometimes. And then, you know, if the party randomly selected the right languages at character creation, then it's not an obstacle. That's not great, you know. It's very much sort of along the same lines as in 5th edition, you have creatures that are straight up immune to non-magical weapon attacks. And then if you have a magic weapon, you completely ignore that and it's a nothing. So either it's a nothing ability, or they're completely immune to anything you can do, because weapon users don't generally do any non-weapon attacks. You know, that's just a really bad way to design an obstacle, is that sometimes it completely stops you, and sometimes it's not even a speed bump, and there's nothing in between. And that's kind of what languages are. So I think it's not an easy thing to do, to make languages an interesting kind of obstacle while also, like, sticking to a kind of world building approach to languages. Because what you want to do is define what what language everyone is speaking, or define what language everything is written in, and what languages you know. Like, that's the natural world building oriented way to approach languages. But I don't think it works particularly well for an RPG. I think you have to approach it more as a game element. I mean, you don't have to, I guess. You don't have to do anything. But I think it works out better if you approach it as a game element rather than as a world building element. Because after all, like, the needs of a story are different for an RPG versus for a novel. If you're writing a novel, absolutely, because you have full control over, you know, what languages everyone knows, what languages everything is written in, and if it is important to the plot, you can do it that way. But for an RPG, I think it's very different. The needs of the plot are quite different than if you are writing a story all by yourself. And so I think the change of approach is advisable. Yeah. Languages are tricky to work into an RPG, and I think there are better ways to do it than the way D&D does it, that aren't just completely ignore it, which, I mean, that's a valid way to approach it, actually. Just say, language doesn't really matter. It's a totally valid way to do it. But I think there's other ways you can make it an element in the game without making it like what D&D does.